Let's proceed here. Um, I'm going to start off with the beginning of the history, and Ariel will be able to do the rest of it. I'm the chair for the San Bruno Mountain Locally Rare Plant Committee for Yerba Buena chapter. I'm a site steward, and I'm responsible for creating this meeting. What I'm going to cover is the lightning rapid disruption of the bay, the founding of Save the Bay, San Bruno Mountain, the very beginning, it was the garbage wars, and then finally Bay Conservation Development Commission and the first battle of San Bruno Mountain, which is West Bay, Manhattan on the Bay. So that's what I'm going to be covering. But the theme is this: ordinary people led the way. People like me and people just like you. And oftentimes it came down to the actions of just one person. And that person could be you. You're getting involved with conservation efforts on San Bruno Mountain. All right. In 1776, Yerba Buena was just barely a part of wilderness, and it was just a couple of tents on the ground. But by 1959, it was a world-famous metropolis. But what happened? In those few years, 186 years, the region had changed from a wilderness to a world-renowned metropolis with millions of residents. And similarly, in less time than the span of most civilizations, the bay was destroyed. The bay was on life support in 1959. Every single city controlled their own waterfront. 40 municipal dumps dumped directly into bay tidelands because it's cheaper to dump your garbage in the bay than to process it. 250 million gallons of raw sewage was dumped into the bay daily. This caused the destruction of the bay fishing industry. 60% of the water that was supposed to be flowing to the bay was redirected for agriculture and other human uses. And the filling of the bay tidelands was routine by every single city that fronted on the bay. So basically, with smell, bacteria, trash, smoke, and mercury, the bay was on life support. The tidelands had been filled in 1994, more than 95% of the historic tidal marshes had been levied and filled. To give you an idea of the filling of the bay, in Berkeley, there was a wide sand beach that went from University Avenue over to Fleming's Point. We now call that Golden Gate Fields, and it's highly developed, but that was a sand beach. Berkeley had a master plan for 2,500 acres of filling, extending 3 miles out into the bay. This is the Golden Spike, the Transcontinental Railroad. You may wonder how that figures in. Well, it has to have a western terminus. Do you know where the western terminus was? It was the bay. It was in Oakland. And right here, this is the Oakland Long Wharf. And that's how the shipping was to get to San Francisco. This is looking back towards Oakland from the wharf. They had to have it this long to get out to deep enough water. So Oakland was the end of the Transcontinental Railroad, and this was going to be further developed. In Emeryville, they had a general plan for a 4-mile-long bay fill. Now, the U.S. Department of Commerce had a report from their Office of Area Development, and it was this: the future development of the San Francisco Bay Area from the year 1960 all the way out to the far future, 2020, our very year now. And what was their question? Their question was, how much of the bay can be usefully developed? The report was a study of land reclamation possibilities. And they noted that 70% of the bay was shallow enough to economically fill and use. The only problem was there was a shortage of economic fill. Dirt. Where are we going to get the dirt? This is a map from their report, and this was how it was translated by the Oakland Tribune. So all the blue areas are areas that could be filled in. The Army Corps of Engineers said that by 2020, the bay will be a narrow shipping channel. And that's where 3 women looking out through this very window, admiring the beauty of the bay, were discussing that article from the Oakland Tribune and said, we like the bay. We think it's beautiful. What are we going to do to stop it from being filled in? And it was Esther Gulick, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Kay Kerr, who have a very important part and the history of San Bruno Mountain. Our chief concern was the beauty of the bay, said Sylvia. We had no idea of the ecological importance of the bay. And in January 1961, in their home in Berkeley, they had a meeting. And they had 13 conservation organizations join them. David Brower of the Sierra Club, Newton Drury of Save the Redwoods. There were 13 different organizations. And they all supported the idea of preserving the bay, but they did not want to spearhead the effort. The reason was simple. We don't do urban areas. We're trying to do virgin forests. So we're willing to give you our mailing list endorsements, but basically, ladies, you're on your own. They were abandoned by all the conservation organizations, but they weren't going to take this lying down. They created a nice flyer, bay or river, and they created an organization. It was called Save San Francisco Bay Association. And what they did is they sent out informational flyers. Memberships were only $1. It was entirely amateur and grassroots. And as they said, we were as green as grass. They had no idea what they're doing, but they knew they wanted to save San Francisco Bay. Now, their first victory was Sylvia McLaughlin joined the Waterfront Advisory Committee for Berkeley. And there was the Berkeley Tidelands Development Proposal, which got tabled by the city council because of their work. But they had early failures as well. The Emeryville 1966 plan for the development for a 4-mile-long bay development fill, it went ahead. So they decided the only way forward was they needed to have a political solution, and they needed to go to Sacramento. And what they did is they asked Nick Petras, who is the representative from Oakland, to the state legislature, and he introduced several bills to the state assembly, and they all failed. So they knew they needed to take a slightly different tact. Now, Mel Scott was at University of California, Berkeley, in the Institute of Government Studies. He had written this book, San Francisco Bay Area, a Metropolis in Perspective. And they asked him to study the problem and to get back. So in 1963, he published this book, The Future of San Francisco Bay. It's a wonderful book, and Mel really had a talent for a turn of phrase because he started the book out with this: who owns San Francisco Bay? To most people, that's as much sense as saying who owns the sky. But as a matter of fact, San Francisco Bay is owned. California had sold much of the Baylands for $1 an acre. This is one of the sales maps. Approximately 50% of the bay, particularly the marshlands and the tidelands, were all in private hands. This is a map from Mel's book showing the private ownership. Now down here is San Mateo County and San Bruno Mountain. And I want you to pay attention to this section. I'm going to reproduce it here. And that area in blue, all of that was owned by the Ideal Cement Company of Denver. They wanted the calcium in the seashells. So they had bought the land. Now, Mel also said residents of San Francisco Bay Area ordinarily do not think of the bay as part of their sewage disposal system, but that's exactly what it is. Every one of these dots is a waste discharge for a sewage system into the bay. And the reason is simple. It's cheaper to throw your sewage into the bay than to process it. So every single city was doing that. 650 million gallons a day. So Scott made a very persuasive case for the need for an organized and long-term planning for San Francisco Bay. It had to be more larger than just the local government. The problem had to be at the state level, but he recognized the need for local home rule. And what he proposed that the state create a temporary commission to study the problem and report back. Now, there's some politically expedient aspects of this. When you ask for a temporary commission, you're more likely to get it than a permanent commission. And if you say all they're going to do is study the problem and report back to us, few people could disagree with it. And what he recommended that they should have is a Bay Conservation and Development Commission. Well, the person in charge of this was none other than Gene McAteer from San Francisco. He was running for mayor at that time. He needed an issue to run on, and he was placed as head of the temporary commission. And they did a great job. The study commission report came in under budget and on time, and it was San Francisco Bay. Now, McAteer also got Don Sherwood from KSFO. Do you remember that phrase, KSFO, the light from below? Well, Sherwood was a little bit of a shock jock, and he and McAteer would talk about the bay on the phone, and he'd call McAteer on the air live and talk about it. And once he even called Pat Brown at home at 7 in the morning. He was still in bed, and said, "Pat, what are you going to do about saving the bay?" Now, he was quite a character. And you remember the Pepsodent commercial, the one that goes, "You wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent"? Do you remember that? Well, Sherwood came up with this phrase: "You'll wonder where the water went when they fill the bay with sediment." And Save the Bay organization was very good at getting people to come up and testify to Sacramento. And, well, we're going to have to take a break. Let's go on the other side of the bay, and we're going to go back a little bit in time. San Francisco's garbage is partly what saved San Bruno Mountain, but we have to look at it. By tradition, San Francisco simply dumped their garbage into the bay or any low-lying part of the city for obvious reasons. It's cheaper to dump it in the bay than to process it. In 1895, the city was suffocating in its own garbage. And the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a law making it illegal to dump garbage in San Francisco. What was their solution? Well, it's easy. You just truck it to the county line and you dump it in San Mateo. They could get away with this because San Mateo was unincorporated. Here's the county line, San Francisco, San Mateo County, and right here is where we're looking. Okay. Now, the original land grant, here's a map from 1835. The land grant was started in 1832, but was finalized in 1835. Here is the name of it. It was Cañada de Guadalupe, La Visitación Rodeo Viejo. Now, interestingly, the title didn't refer to Mount San Bruno Mountain at all. It just talked about the valleys, which were what were the financially lucrative parts of it. And this here was Visitation Valley. Now, Cañada Visitación became Visitation City, and it was established in 1853, but it was very rural. Here it is in 1910. And even by 1920, it only had 28 residents. And you can imagine they couldn't stand up to the city of San Francisco. Now, around 1930, the name changed from Visitation City to Brisbane. And Brisbane was the site of San Francisco dumping their garbage. It was a small, unincorporated area surrounded by powerful neighbors, and was largely ignored by San Francisco and San Mateo, but not for long. San Francisco was running out of space to dump into San Mateo, and they needed more space. So the first fight for filling of the bay was the garbage wars. Now, garbage was collected at that time by these scavenger wagons. You had to be Sicilian and Italian to get into the company. And the companies over time had amalgamated, and there are two large ones, Sunset Scavenger and Golden Gate Disposal. Now, together they had a company called Sanitary Fill, which was their burial agent. And the city of Brisbane was incorporated in 1961 by Sanitary Fill on the Southern Pacific Railroad, who owned some of the land. And they were talking about right here, Visitation Bay. Now, San Francisco had been dumping since the 1900s into this area, but that area was filled and they needed to find a new one. San Francisco was dumping 650 tons per day. Here it is in 1921. You can see the Southern Pacific rail lines there coming across here. And all of this was the garbage, but they're filling it up and they needed to find a new area to dump. So one of the big issues facing Brisbane when it was incorporated was being San Francisco's garbage dump. They didn't like it. The new city council had to vote in 1961 on the contract, and a lot of big money was riding on this. And the vote went 3-2 in favor. And I want you to note, just one vote made the difference. Well, some citizens didn't like that, and they organized against the Sanitary Fill contract. They called themselves the Brisbane Citizens for Civic Progress. And Save the Bay gave them a whopping $300 to help fight Bayfill. The new city council was elected to fight the contract. And interestingly, Brisbane's lawyer was a young starting out lawyer. He was a newspaper columnist and on the staff for Bechtel Corporation. And his name was Caspar Weinberger. Remember that name because he's going to figure in the further tale here. So Save the San Francisco Bay Association changed the name to Save the Bay. And in 1967, Brisbane citizens were very involved with Save the Bay. And interestingly, 2 members of Brisbane gathered 27,000 signatures, and they wanted to present it to Governor Reagan. And when they came to his office, the secretary would not let them in, and they were turned away. And as they left, who did they run into? Reagan's director of finance, none other than Caspar Weinberger, who had been their attorney. And he got them seen by Governor Reagan. It was a lucky chance. And in 1965, the temporary Bay Conservation Development Commission was made. And in 1969, it was permanent, and Reagan signed it. One vote passed it out of the assembly, sending it to Ronald Reagan. One thing I always thought was funny is the 3 women on the right are the ones who saved the Bay. And who's Reagan talking to? The men. But we really owe a tremendous amount to Esther Gulick, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Kay Kerr. Save the Bay. Now, the garbage wars. Sanitary Phil, which was the burial agent, remember, for the garbage companies, and Southern Pacific Railroad were working together. They had some land over at Sierra Point, but it was tidal. And the Bay Conservation Development Commission was going to stop it. So they were working like crazy to block it off so it wasn't tidal anymore. But the Bay Conservation Development Commission sued Sanitary Landfill and stopped them. Only a 29-acre dump was made at Sierra Point. Now, we went from the garbage wars to the biggest battle. Save the Bay and BCDC next fought their biggest battle, and that was West Bay. Now, the San Mateo County Master Plan in 1965 called for a lot of development, and one thing was a freeway out in the bay. It would be 2 to 3 miles out in the bay, and they would build it on fill, and then industry can fill in from the bay to the rest of the shoreline, and you'd make a bunch of taxable land out of useless bay land. They even had a name for it. This was called the Bayfront Freeway. It already had a name. It was Highway 289. Now, does this sound far-fetched to you? No. This was an era of massive public works. Think of Eisenhower's freeway system coast to coast. The Commerce Department had done a study already. They said the only problem was a shortage of fill. All you needed to do this project was money, dirt, and bayland. Money, dirt, and bayland. Money. Rockefeller plans a big city in San Francisco Bay. In 1965, Warren Cramner of Citibank, who was owned by Rockefeller, came out to the Brisbane City Council, and his proposal, this is not a big deal. Let's just give San Bruno Mountain a haircut. Dirt. The dirt was going to come from San Bruno Mountain. Crocker Land Company owned it, and it'd be very easy to take the dirt from San Bruno Mountain and dump it in the bay. And where would they dump it? Right here, where the Ideal Cement Company owned bayland. So this was called the West Bay Project. It was going to remove 250 million cubic yards of dirt from San Bruno Mountain and fill in 26 linear miles of coast. It was 23.5 square miles of land. It would be 17 times the size of Foster City. And incidentally, it'd be half the size of San Francisco. This is a massive project. It was called New Manhattan. It already had a name. And they were going to create a city of 50 to 70,000 on the flat area of San Bruno Mountain that they're going to create. Now, how were they going to do West Bay? It'd be easy. You just have a conveyor belt over 101, put the dirt on a barge, take the barge down the bay, go past the airport right here, and Ideal Cement owned this bayland. Just dump it in here, and you've got a new city. New Manhattan. Now, the West Bay project was promoted very slickly, and the Crocker Land Company was involved. Now, they were a big developer. They did Serramonte Shopping Center. In fact, they did all of these developments. So the Crocker Land Company was not to be trifled with. They were not to be underestimated because they were used to doing projects of this size. It would take them 30 years to develop West Bay, but they were planning on doing it. However, a number of approvals were needed. Now, Save the Bay got involved. They mobilized a large number of voters, and the BCDC got involved, and they prohibited the filling. So that stopped that part of it. The city of Brisbane had control of the conveyor belt across Brisbane, 101 in Brisbane land, and they nixed it. And the County Board of Supervisors for San Mateo County, on a 3-2 vote, voted against it. Now, Baciocco is the one who cast the deciding vote. And Ed Baciocco, for the rest of his life, was hounded by other friends who were developers. And I know this from talking to one of Ed's brothers. But he cast the vote, and that one vote was what partly saved San Bruno Mountain. And also by this time, the San Mateo County General Plan was not for developing it with a freeway out in the bay. They wanted to park on the north part of the county. They wanted to park on San Bruno Mountain. So I want to tell you that the mountain is never saved. You don't have development on the mountain, but it's still being invaded by plants. Now, the prelude to the first battle was the Garbage Wars. The first battle of San Bruno Mountain was West Bay, and the second battle is Visitation